Why is the global supply chain so vulnerable? What is supply chain immunity? And how can we enhance national supply chain immunity? I will explore these questions and so much more with our very special guest, Dr. Rob Handfield, contributor to the IBM Center Special Report, COVID-19 and its Impact, 7 essays on reframing government management and operations. So, Rob, I'd like to explore the essay you did for the IBM Center Special Report, COVID-19 and its Impact. And your essay is Achieving Supply Chain Immunity, Planning, Preparation, and Coordination in National Emergency Response. But first, perhaps you could provide us with some context. Rob, what is the supply chain? And could you highlight the key players within a supply chain?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't think a lot of people even knew a lot about what a supply chain is before COVID. A supply chain really is a series of connected enterprises that exchange materials. They exchange information. There are financial flows between them, and then there are also what I would call relational flows between them. So it is really a value-creating system of multiple enterprises connected. Within the United States, a lot of the products that were used in the healthcare response had supply chains that extended outside of the country. In many of the materials like PPE and ventilators and so forth had supply chains that extended all the way to China. So many of the materials that we required for this response were outside the span of control of the United States.
From your research, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the global supply chain?
Well, this COVID response, I think, has really raised an issue and increasing awareness of our exposure to these global supply chains, where we really don't own the materials that are required for this response. And this became clear, during an interview with the CEO of 3M. He was interviewed by Congress and was asked, well, what percentage of your N95 masks are produced in the United States? And his response was, well, about 35%. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. But what he did not state was that all of the raw materials, the rubber bands, the actual spunbound material, the nose bridges, were all produced overseas. So it was only the final assembly and packaging that was done here in the United States. And what this really exposed, this event and others, was that our federal response mechanism doesn't really understand who is in these critical supply chains. We don't have very good visibility into, the demand requirements, and this isn't just for PPE and masks, but this really involves any kind of material that's required in an emergency. And there often isn't a lot of, there's very poor communication, in fact, between multiple agencies. And you have multiple agencies that need to be responsive. You have FEMA, you have DHS, you have DLA, you have CDC. And there was really a lot of confused communication regarding standards. NIOSH was involved regarding distribution of materials. And as a result, there really wasn't a lot of acquisition and planning capability, which resulted in a very poorly executed response to this COVID crisis. And I think what we're calling for here in my paper, what I believe is we need to do better. We really need to develop a more effective national response system. And this is based on my work. I was involved in the Joint Acquisition Task Force, which was trying to find sources of PPE for FEMA and the federal government, working with the U.S. Air Force and a number of other players. And during the conversations we had with FEMA and other agencies, it really exposed their, I hate to use this word, but naivete in terms of where these supply chains were and where this material was coming from. And that resulted in this sort of Hunger Games scenario where everyone was competing with one another over decision rights and ownership of issues. And at some point, I think the federal government also kicked it out to the states and said, well, states now you're in charge of finding your own material in response. One of the things I was also involved in was we interviewed every chief procurement officer in every state in the country. And we collected all of these stories of how they just scrambled to find PPE. They weren't able to get it. Some of them had never bought anything outside of their state. They were relying on these third-party distributors like Cardinal Health or McKesson. And these guys were running out of material as well. And so all of a sudden now they were having to pay upfront, cash upfront to suppliers in China that they had never worked before. And there was counterfeiting going on. There was scam artists. It was really a chaotic situation. And that's where we came up with this idea for, a much more effective planning response. We call it supply chain immunity.
Rob, you mentioned supply chain immunity. What does it mean, and how can this concept become a reality in an increasingly unpredictable and uncertain world?
Well, the idea of supply chain immunity came about, actually, we thought the immunity concept associated with the virus was a perfect metaphor. Because if you think about immunity, what is it? It's really an antibody that is developed in your body. And the antibody recognizes that there's an intruder, that there's a threat to their health system, and they fight it. In most cases, people will get sick for a while. They won't feel well as the antibodies kick in and fight the virus. And your entire body is focused on fighting this virus. And then after a while, you feel better, and in most cases, at least, you get out of it and you're okay. And so this idea of how do we create supply chain immunity? How do we create a system that can deal with various types of threats in an increasingly unpredictable and uncertain world? And by threats, we mean not just things like pandemics, but cyber terrorism or real terrorism or crazy weather like we had in Texas, or hurricanes. How do we deal with these kinds of threats to our national security? And what we thought was there were really four key attributes that we believed are really important to create an immune national supply chain system. And let me kind of go through each of these, and I think it'll be helpful to talk about them. The first is flexibility, and a key component in a future supply chain response is the ability to deal with various types of situations that might occur. And the only way that's going to happen is if you have a sort of a playbook. A playbook is just like something that a coach uses in like for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They have a playbook, and they vary that playbook based on the situation and what happens. But there's actually a plan in place. And this playbook determines who will be on the team. You'll need, as I said before, SNS, ASPR, DHS, BARDA, CDC, all of the alphabet. And you'll get all the right people. And that team should get early on clarity on what is the problem that we're facing. And how do we work together to address this problem? And it sets a cadence of meetings, and it sets expectations on what we're going to do. So that is really important to have that playbook that enables you to be flexible to these different kinds of situations that might arise. The second component is what I call traceability or transparency. And this is really about managing your assets. And the key phrase here is you can't manage what you can't see. So during the pandemic, the national stockpile really had no idea of what materials they had in their warehouses or distribution centers. They didn't know what the expiration dates were on there. They didn't have a tracking system. So we need to be able to see, what material we have available and what assets we have available. And we also need a way to effectively communicate between different parties, through digital assets, through data, and understanding, what contracts also are in place that will allow us to source what we need. And those contracts ideally should have some kind of clauses that require priority given an emergency for the federal government. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be made available. And this transparency should be in real time. We have technologies today that clearly will enable this real-time visibility. The third component is what I'll call responsiveness. This is what we saw during the pandemic, again, was real lags and gaps in decision making. And it wasn't just a bureaucratic response. It was really an inability to really understand who was in charge. So that playbook should identify, who is the leadership team and who's calling the shots. And it should also bring in the right experts that have the requisite knowledge and experience and external market intelligence. And so what we're advocating is you really need a full-time team of people to understand, what's happening out there in the world and have a radar on potential threats that are out there and the ability to quickly bring together that team and to debrief them and say, here's what's going on. We better get ahead of this. We better start to respond. Again, if we look back at what happened with the pandemic, the folks in the national stockpile, to their credit, they knew that there was going to be a problem, and they knew this as early as January. And they were getting signals from their distributors that there was not going to be enough PPE available to respond to this crisis. They went to the head of the CDC, they went to Washington, and they expressed this concern. Well, the problem is the people in charge were clinicians, they were epidemiologists, brilliant people who don't understand what a supply chain is and how it operates. And so, it was really all for naught, and they were unable to act quickly. And that's one of the things in a crisis. You have to act quickly. You have to be responsive. Time is absolutely of the essence. So we need leadership, and we need the right people to get early warning and to act quickly when these things happen. The fourth and final component of supply chain immunity is what I call global independence. And there's a lot of talk right now on the Hill. Joe Biden and others are talking about building a national manufacturing guard and insourcing and bringing back all of these manufacturing assets back to the United States. That's all well and good, but again, it's very naive. Many of these industries are gone. The electronics sector is not coming back. A lot of the low-cost healthcare supplies are not coming back. They're produced in low-cost countries. And there's a reason for that. I mean, these countries are able to produce these materials at a very low cost, much more efficiently. And it's not necessarily something that the United States would do well. So we have to be a little more realistic to say, well, if we can't bring all this manufacturing back, then let's create a domestic network of trusted suppliers and of trusted people throughout the global supply chains that we can work with, and that we can get early warning to these risks, and that we can move quickly, through our contracts and through our relationships to build a more flexible and collaborative supply chain through a co-determined future relationship with the U.S. government. And I think a lot of suppliers would gladly work with the U.S. government and be part of that U.S.-centric network and get access to our markets. So I think those are the four components that I talk about in the paper. And, I'll tell you that we have started having some conversations with a couple of offices, Senator Peters' office, Senator Coon's office, but these are in the very early stages. I know there's a lot of bills floating out about this idea right now, but it's still at a very early stage, I believe.
You raised the point that independence is a key attribute for creating supply chain immunity. Can you tell us what needs to happen in order to foster a supply chain that is both globally engaged but also relatively independent of global shocks to the system?
Well, this is an excellent point right now, and I think the country is sort of going through a self-examination of why can't we, bring N95 manufacturing back to the U.S. Why can't we bring ventilator production? And I actually interviewed, General Motors, who actually did just that. They started producing ventilators. Now we've got, boatloads of ventilators sitting in inventory. but the question, it's a great question, and it raises an important point. So if the U.S. says, okay, we want to bring domestic manufacturing of these critical components back to the United States, well, who's going to fund that, for one thing? And I can tell you right now, there's a good likelihood that the cost of that PPE and equipment and masks is going to be much higher than what we're paying for it right now, because it's being produced in a low-cost country where labor is very low. So will CMS be willing to make up that difference when they start paying for Medicare and Medicaid bills that come in from hospitals? I don't think so. All right. So it's unlikely that we're really going to foot the bill for this reshoring of wave of reshoring that people are talking about. There is, however, another potential solution, and this is where I think it gets interesting. I think what we will see is I think we're going to start to see regional sourcing. And by that, I mean, I think the world will start to move to sort of these global economic regions. And certainly, within North America, we have Mexico as relatively low-cost labor. Canada has relatively low-cost natural resources. And the United States has very low-cost capital resources. So I think, there's really a regional argument that can be made that if those three countries come together, we could probably become much more self-reliant. And we might see the same thing happen in Europe and Eastern Europe, Middle East and Africa, and China and Southeast Asia. So I think we may start to see these regional ecosystems start to play out. But again, that's going to require some significant negotiation and government involvement to allow those trade flows to begin to occur.
So, Rob, the next quality you mentioned is the value of traceability or visibility, the ability to see your products along the supply chain. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this looks like in practice? How do we get there? And what technology may help us get there?
So traceability and visibility begins with what I would call sort of a solid master database. So you need to have good data. You need to have quality data, and there needs to be a system of data governance to track all this stuff. I've done some work with GSA, and unfortunately, the federal government is known for the horrific condition of most of their data, which is really bad. I mean, to give you an idea, at GSA one time we were working with spend data, and we noticed that there was one particular category of items that was being sourced a lot, and the category code, and it was soybeans, and we said, well, why the heck are we buying so many soybeans? And we looked, and the category code for soybeans was 0000. So what buyers were doing is they didn't want to fill it out, so they were just punching in 4 numbers and filling up the database with all this lousy data. So we need to get a good system of data governance, first of all, and I think we also need to automate the capture of this data. And to give you an idea, we interviewed someone at the Strategic National Stockpile who said that when they were receiving PPE, they literally would have the guys working in the warehouse take a picture of the pallet on their cell phones and load that up to the database. So it was really sort of rudimentary types of data tracking. So I think we'll need to use barcodes and QR codes. And again, this is standard technology. This is old technology. It's not that expensive. Once you have this data, then you need to be able to organize it and track it in real time. And one of the technologies we hear a lot about is what's called a control tower. And a control tower is basically a dashboard that shows the current status of material in the system, where it is, how it's being consumed, where it's being shipped. And it's giving you an update on all of this in real time. So I think it's possible for the government, even if they don't physically own all of this material, they can require that all of their contractors and all of the hospitals also provide access to the data so that the government can know where all this stuff is and be able to move it around if they need to hotspots, to be able to better plan, to be able to better respond to what's happening. And again, this is not expensive technology. I wrote a book called The Living Supply Chain that talks about a company, Pulse, that developed a real-time control tower. And they had 29 factories all over the world, and they could see every single bit of inventory in real time and know where it was. And this is what I think we have to be thinking about is this data visibility and material visibility. And it's equivalent to, driving your car down the street with no speedometer or no gas tank or no GPS, right? You don't know where you're going. You don't know how fast you're going. And you don't know if you're going to be running out of gas anytime soon. So we need this data to be able to operate these global supply chains and to be able to respond and plan and take action on what's happening around us.
What are supply risk tools? Perhaps you can, it's back on your Harvard Business Review article where you talk about them. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about them and why is it important to deploy them to identify, manage, monitor, and mitigate risk supplies that could impact your operations? And perhaps you could kind of illustrate what they are.
Absolutely. And I've seen some of these risk tools at work. The first step, even before you invest in a risk technology, is to map out your supply chain. Like I said earlier, figure out who are your key suppliers and then who are your key suppliers. So armed with that information, you can begin to invest in what are called these supply chain risk tools. And one of the most prominent that's out there is a tool called Resilink. There's also others called Risk Metrics. DHL has one as well. But essentially, what these risk tools are is they will take your list of suppliers and their geographic location, and they will put them on a map of the world. And then these risk platforms will then use machine-based learning. They'll scan news feeds, they'll scan Twitter data, and they will identify, all of the events that are going on in the world and put them on this global map. If any of those events fall within a certain circumference, maybe it's 5 or 10 miles of your suppliers that you've given them, you will get a warning. You'll get an early warning that, hey, there may be something going on here. You should probably contact your supplier or talk to them or, take measures. Again, it's that early warning. So they don't tell you what to do, but they do tell you if you have an event that's going on in some part of the world. Maybe it could be a political event, it could be a terrorist event, it could be weather, it could be an earthquake, or it could be a pandemic like this one. And if more people had known what was going on in Wuhan, they could have acted earlier. Again, a great example. This company Flex had early warning that there was a problem in Wuhan with the government shutting things down and the markets were shutting down. So very early on, they realized there was going to be a problem, and they were alerted to this by I think they were using Resilink at the time, and they made some phone calls and they learned very quickly, yep, this is indeed what's happening. So they got in touch with suppliers. They started getting more PPE. They started moving production around. So they could take some of these early measures to avert what could have been a potential complete shutdown of their supply chain, and we're able to convert it into a relatively minor issue based on that information.
Are there any other recommendations you would like to offer that organizations can follow in their pursuit of supply chain immunity?
Well, I think that we're seeing overall an overall trend. We have a new book coming out called Flow: How Supply Chains Thrive, and I think the natural flow, if you will, of what's happening in supply chains is we are moving towards, as I said, these more localized regional supply chains. And so I think the question will come about how do we put in policies to support entrepreneurs from beginning to reopen the manufacturing back locally, and how do we support that? And I think it'll create jobs, but I think there's also the issue of immigration policies that may come into play. Or do we have enough workers to staff all these jobs? And will we have policies that will allow people to come to the U.S. and work in these factories if we don't have enough domestic workers? So there's some really interesting policy issues that all of these recommendations sort of weave together, and I believe it's going to be an interesting time. I think we're going to see some major shifts in the supply chain, and I also believe that as we get more visibility and we apply some of these technologies, I think our supply chains will shrink. I think they'll get faster. We'll see increased flow, increased velocity of material in these supply chains. People will be acting more quickly. Some of the jobs around planning will be done by automation, not by Excel spreadsheets in the future. I think there's a lot of change ahead, and we've only just seen the beginning of it.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, a series on how the pandemic has transformed government management and operations with Dr. Robert Handfield, contributor to the IBM Center Special Report, COVID-19 and its Impact. Subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.